This video has been sponsored by Squarespace. I need to confess something to you guys. I am a Lord of the Rings fan. I've read the books, I've watched the movies, I've watched every movie ever made, in fact, including reading an unmade script, and I've even seen the musical twice. But I have never before played a Lord of the Rings video game. Not even the LEGO ones. But I am aware of the fact that these games are a huge deal, and that they have contributed greatly, for better and for worse, to the cultural conception of the Lord of the Rings. Now, I don't have time to sit down today and play all of these games, mostly because it's like 85 degrees in the studio and I'd die before I was able to do that, so we will have to wait for a rainy day for me to play these games. Rather, today I'm going to walk you through over 40 years of Middle-earth video game history, from the craziness of rights disputes to labor abuse scandals, to figure out what these games did right and what they may have done wrong, how they developed over time, and what they have to say about the story that inspired them. J.R.R. Tolkien died in 1973, meaning that for the most part, he missed the dawn of the video game. This also means that he was not around in 1982, when the very first Middle-earth video game was published by Australian developer Beam Software. And although the rights to The Lord of the Rings are now a highly coveted multi-million-dollar property, that wasn't always the case, and back in the early 80s, sometimes the Tolkien estate would establish deals with the people that they sold their licenses to, that those people could resell their licenses. So it was that the 1980 Rankin and Bass Return of the King animated Lord of the Rings film was able to share their rights with Beam Software, and in 1982 they created The Hobbit, an illustrated text adventure adaptation of Tolkien's first best-selling book. The game was relatively simple in its presentation, but it was innovative for its time, far more verbose than most games of its ilk, and integrating slightly more realistic game physics and images. And the people loved it. Beam's adaptation of The Hobbit sold over 500,000 units, won awards, and set the bar comparatively high for Lord of the Rings video games to come. A year later, in 1983, there was an effort to create an Atari game based in Middle-earth called The Lord of the Rings: The Journey to Rivendell, but that never materialized. Rather, our next entry is in 1985, when Beam released The Lord of the Rings Game 1. Much like its Hobbit predecessor, this game was a text-based adventure with plenty of puzzles, although it wasn't quite the smash hit that The Hobbit was. The physics weren't as clean, the puzzles were a little bit clunky, and although it still sold moderately well, it would never reach the heights of The Hobbit. But you know what would surpass the heights of your expectations? The website that you're going to create using this video's sponsor, Squarespace. Squarespace is the all-in-one website building platform that's going to help you stand out and succeed online. And with Squarespace's cutting-edge design tools, anyone can build themselves a perfectly personalized website. Just start with one of their professionally designed website templates or with their website builder, and use their intuitive drag-and-drop technology to create a website that beautifully matches your brand and personal style. With your Squarespace site, you can set up email campaigns, sell content, and even collect donations directly from your site, and you can keep track of all of this using Squarespace's built-in analytics tools. You can review your website traffic, figure out where to focus your engagement, and track your revenue all in one easy place. If you're interested in refreshing an existing brand or building a completely new one, Squarespace is the place to do it. Just head down to squarespace.com for a completely free trial, and when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/JessoftheShire to get 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. Thank you so much to Squarespace for sponsoring this video, and thanks to all of you for checking out my sponsors. Now, that same year, in 1985, we got another Middle-earth themed video game, but this one was definitely not created by Beam Studios, and it also definitely was not created with an official license. Board of the Rings was a parody ripping off the concept and the title of the 1969 Harvard Lampoon book Board of the Rings, but this game also kind of counts as a spoof of the Beam video games themselves, as well as just being a spoof of the story of The Lord of the Rings. Created by 16-year-old Fergus McNeil under the title of Delta 4 Studios, the game is a comedic, crude retelling of The Lord of the Rings, starring, of course, Fordo, Spam, Pimply, and Murky on their journey to Mount Gloom. Now, it is important to note that this game is not technically an adaptation of the Harvard Lampoon Board of the Rings. McNeill read Board of the Rings and really enjoyed it, but when he reached out to Harvard Lampoon to see if they would allow him to make an adaptation of it, they never got back to him. Fortunately, this was the 80s, and he was 16, so he just went ahead and made the game anyway and just didn't worry about any legal issues. Board of the Rings was sold primarily through mail order, and although it never became a mainstream success by any means, it was personally fulfilling and entertaining enough for McNeill to create a sequel, The Boggart Board 2, which features characters that I cannot name for risk of demonetization. Although they are a bit of a silly footnote, these games prove just how desperate people were to see The Lord of the Rings in this new medium. For as long as video games have been being made, people from every walk of life at every age have been trying to get The Lord of the Rings in a video game. In 1987, Beam Software put out Shadows of Mordor, Game 2 of The Lord of the Rings, which followed Frodo and Sam further on their journey to Mount Doom, through more text-based narrative gameplay. But in 1988, another developer would get their hands on the property, creating War in Middle-earth. Made by Synergistic Software and Maelstrom Games, this was a real-time strategy game that allowed the player large-scale control of entire armies, as depicted originally in Tolkien's works. Regarded as faithful but somewhat bland, this game would break the mold of the text-based adventure-style game and lay the groundwork for many different styles of Middle-earth video games to come. In 1989, Beam released their next entry, The Crack of Doom, which follows Frodo and Sam specifically up Mount Doom. Although it was a fine game, this was regarded as worse than the others that came before it. It seems that after the highs they found in The Hobbit, the quality of the Beam games were steadily declining. In 1990, Interplay Productions got their hands on the intellectual property and created J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings Volume 1. This was a game played on PCs with an open-world RPG style of play that emphasized maps. And it's interesting that when development first began, this wasn't actually meant to be a Middle-earth game at all. Originally, they had just set out to create a generic fantasy video game, and then Interplay got their hands on the rights, and so they had their development team pivot, turning this generic fantasy game into a specifically Lord of the Rings themed game. I would say that this game marks the first time that developers had to contend with an issue that would arise in almost every other Middle-earth video game adaptation to come. How do you tell this very familiar story while keeping it fresh? In all likelihood, if you picked up this game in the year 1990, you knew at least the basic plot points of The Lord of the Rings. So a game retelling that plot exactly can't have twists or puzzles that you don't already know the answer to. The solution for the team at Interplay for this particular game was to use side quests. So you could have the major canon plot events occurring, but there would still be little mini adventures that you could go on that might be able to surprise you. J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings Volume 1 wasn't exactly a smash hit, but it did well enough that they began work on Volume 2. In 1991, we get the final Beam game with J.R.R. Tolkien's The Riders of Rohan. And fun fact about this game, it was actually published by Konami, better known for publishing games like Silent Hill, Metal Gear Solid, and Castlevania. Diverging from previous Beam games, Riders of Rohan was a strategic, turn-based game that took place in Rohan during Saruman's attacks, where a player could control entire armies. And this game went across fine. It was less story-based and more combat-driven than previous Beam games, and it was noted that unless the player was already familiar with the story and the lore of The Lord of the Rings, it was unlikely that they'd be able to find any real story in this game at all. Some people played this game, but it wasn't a whole lot, and it seems that although Beam had started the fire of the Lord of the Rings video game, it was time for them to pass the torch on. In 1992, Interplay came out with J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings Volume 2, The Two Towers, which beyond having a stupidly long title, was very similar in content and gameplay to Volume 1, but was received even more poorly. And with its lackluster profits, all efforts towards a third volume were stopped in their tracks. And after that game, for about 10 years, all was quiet on the Lord of the Rings video game front. That was until 2002. Now, something very significant happened in the year 2001. The release of the first Peter Jackson Lord of the Rings movie. This movie was an instant hit, and it brought a lot of new eyes to the Lord of the Rings in general. And so, the fact that in 2002, just a year after that first movie came out, we see a video game released that is titled The Lord of the Rings: The Fellowship of the Ring, it's not particularly surprising. What is surprising is the fact that this game has absolutely nothing to do with this movie. The game was produced by Shire, working under Vivendi, and Vivendi had acquired the rights to the books, and not to the movies. This caused a lot of complications, as they couldn't visually or textually reference anything that could be considered property of the Peter Jackson films. This meant constant back and forth with the Tolkien estate, trying to remove what they referred to as movie pollution, wherever they deemed that it was an overstep. This actually got so litigious that the developers were forced to remove any and all tomatoes from the backgrounds and content of their scenes, because tomatoes were a New World food, and thus not in the books, and thus mention of tomatoes would clearly be a reference to the movies. The game developers were also dealing with a lot of pressure from higher-ups. The original plan for this game was for it to be a relatively small-scale game, published only to be played on Xbox. But the folks with the money wanted to make it appeal to as wide of an audience as possible, and they pushed for more of an action-adventure tone and for it to be made on multiple consoles. Between wrestling with the IP issues and dealing with constant input from their higher-ups, by the time that this game was created, the developers found it completely unrecognizable to the product that they had initially wanted to create. That same year, as The Lord of the Rings: The Fellowship of the Ring game came out, we also got The Lord of the Rings: The Two Towers coming out. That is the game, and not the movie. Although the movie also did come out in 2002. Okay. This gets really confusing, so let me just lay it out. So in 2001, The Lord of the Rings: Fellowship of the Ring movie came out. The next year, in 2002, The Lord of the Rings: The Fellowship of the Ring game came out, which was made by Sierra and completely unassociated with the movies. Also in 2002, The Lord of the Rings: The Two Towers movie came out, as did The Lord of the Rings: The Two Towers game, which, unlike the Fellowship of the Ring game, was not created by Sierra and was intended to be associated with the movies. I wrote that, and I'm not even sure if that makes sense, but while Vivendi were wrestling with rights issues with the Tolkien estate, Electronic Arts, aka EA, swept in and purchased the rights to the movie IP. This game was allowed to directly reference the Peter Jackson films and capitalize off of the movie's cultural sway, and although there was a little bit of back and forth about what they could and could not portray, it seems like they had a much easier go of it than Sierra and Vivendi did. The Lord of the Rings: The Two Towers game adapted largely the second book, The Two Towers, but integrated parts of the first movie for context. This was a hack-and-slash game, leaning more into combat than role-playing or adventure, but it was very well received, selling over 4 million copies. In 2003, Sierra and Vivendi came out with their next Lord of the Rings game, titled The Hobbit. And while their Lord of the Rings game had been wounded somewhat in their wrestling with the IP holders, the Hobbit game was absolutely brutalized. The original intent of the game was a Fable-esque role-playing episodic adventure, and many of the developers of the game were really big fans of the book that wanted to see its light and playful tone successfully adapted into the video game format. However, the Tolkien estate stepped in once more, causing a whole bunch of problems. First off, they were very touchy about what could and could not be included, and then the worst part was that they would take forever to get back about reviewing anything. And oftentimes when they did finally get back with their reviews and what they wanted changed, they would be asking for changes that required the game to be rebuilt almost completely from the ground up. And on top of all of that, the studios were once again pushing for the game to be more digestible. They urged the developers to go more towards Mario as a vision rather than Zelda, in order to pander to the perceived very young audience of The Hobbit. The result was a 3D platforming style game that clung very heavily and shallowly to the events of the book, and in my opinion, it just looked really bad. Despite all of these difficulties, Sierra and Vivendi were not going down without a fight, and that same year, they published The Lord of the Rings: The War of the Ring, a real-time strategy PC game. This game was not very well received and ended up being the last Sierra Vivendi Lord of the Rings game, as they lost the licensing soon after. And I tell you what, 2003 must have been a crazy year to be someone who played Lord of the Rings video games, because on top of Sierra's The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings: The War of the Ring, we also got EA's next game, The Lord of the Rings: The Return of the King. That is, the game and not the movie. Although that did also come out in the year 2003. Released just a month before the movie, this was another Peter Jackson game that capitalized on the movie's hype. This game included voice acting from many of the movie's stars, especially Viggo Mortensen, as well as Easter eggs like secret cast interviews, which were only available in the game. Another hack and slash like The Two Towers, this game was an absolute hit for both reviews and sales, and it remains one of the most highly regarded Lord of the Rings video games to this day. EA's next entry came in 2004 with The Lord of the Rings: The Third Age. Leaning away from the more hack and slash style into more of a strategic role-playing game, this game used mocap to get a style somewhat similar to the Final Fantasy games. This game followed the plot of the movie more or less, but it did deal with that issue that we mentioned way back in the Interplay days. How do you tell a story that people just finished watching in theaters, but tell it in a way that feels refreshing? In a way that feels like you have some kind of agency over canon events. In order to fix this, EA developed what they called the Shadow Fellowship, made up of parallel but not identical characters to the actual Fellowship. This party was able to follow along on the heels of canon events, interfering and getting involved and having some agency, but not majorly affecting the way that the overarching story would play out. They basically took some background characters, like a Gondorian guard, an elf, a ranger, a dwarf, etc., and they let them follow just a little bit behind the Fellowship. So they'd be cleaning up the Watcher in the water after the Fellowship departs. They'd be helping at Helm's Deep, or joining in Faramir's fight. This was a really useful device to allow canon to continue unimpeded, while also allowing the player a feeling of agency within the events. Of course, they did run into some rights issues, as they only had the movie rights and were not allowed to portray anything that was not presented in the movies. This was to the point where they wanted to show a dwarf army, something that seems fairly obvious, but were told no by the Tolkien estate, because there was only one dwarf in the movie, so you can't have a whole dwarf army made up of just Gimli. Overall, reviews for The Lord of the Rings: The Third Age were mostly positive enough to keep the ball rolling on more EA Lord of the Rings games. Also in 2004, EA put out The Lord of the Rings: The Battle for Middle-earth, a strategy-based RPG that was pretty well received. Using some movie clips and voice actors from the films, this game allows players to control entire armies in large-scale war, giving them the opportunity to allot resources, build defenses, and choose their fighting style. Now, the game went over just fine, but there was a live journal post that came out revealing the working conditions of the developers of this game. According to this post, during the crunch time of this game, EA demanded that its employees work incredibly long hours, up to 12 hours, sometimes longer, with no overtime, and it got to the point where many employees were calling out sick due to sheer exhaustion. This live journal post would lead to 3 class action lawsuits against EA, and it marked a shift in labor laws in the game development industry, which, while mostly unrelated to the game itself, is a really interesting part of the legacy of Lord of the Rings video games. In 2005, EA released The Lord of the Rings Tactics, which, as the name implies, was a tactical RPG playable on the PlayStation Portable. It's kind of comparable to Fire Emblem, and the game contains some direct direct clips of the films, but has been criticized for how little it actually has to do with the original book's story. This game was not very well performing and only sold 130,000 copies worldwide. The sequel for The Lord of the Rings: The Battle for Middle-earth came out in 2006, and it was received even better than its predecessor. The graphics were improved, it was available on more than just PC, and by the time this game was in development, EA had acquired the rights to the books as well as the movies. And astonishingly, this rights package also included the rights to the Silmarillion. And if you know anything about the roller coaster ride that is the selling of the rights to The Lord of the Rings, you know how rare it is for anyone to get their hands on the Silmarillion. It's pretty much never happened, other than this time that EA was able to include the Silmarillion in their games. This meant that they could finally expand beyond the limited scope of the movies, featuring characters like Glorfindel and Tom Bombadil. Although it was still a large-scale strategy-based game, Battle for Middle-earth 2 perfectly expanded on what people loved from the first game, and it was very popular. In 2006, development began on what would have been an absolutely revolutionary project from EA, The Lord of the Rings: The White Council. Described as Elder Scrolls meets The Lord of the Rings, this was announced as an open-world role-playing game, which would allow for customized player characters, and would have partnered with Christopher Tolkien to integrate the since untapped lore of the Silmarillion into the world that they were creating. I don't play any video games today just because my brain doesn't work that way, but back in the day, I did love me an open world RPG. These were some of the ones that I played and spent many, many hours on, and I just know that if this game, The Lord of the Rings: The White Council, had been created, it would have been one of my favorite games of all time. But unfortunately, as you may have guessed based on the way I'm talking about it, this project never came to fruition. With its flying mechanics and dragons and epic storylines, the project was just too ambitious, and allegedly, when the production team informed EA that they would need 3 more years to work on it before they were able to publish it, EA pulled all funding and cancelled the project. But in 2007, we would see a surprise entry from someone other than EA, The Lord of the Rings Online. Originally created by Turbine, this game was an MMORPG, or Mass Multiplayer Online Role-Playing Game, and it brought the world of Middle-earth to life through interactive online play. Much of the gameplay of The Lord of the Rings Online is based on community and working together, each player creating their own custom character to inhabit the world and take on quests. Turbine licensed the book content, not the movie content, and it seems like overall, especially compared to the way that Vivendi and Sierra talked about it, they had a much better relationship with the Tolkien estate. They kept the scope of this game manageable by releasing it in chunks, gradually over the course of almost 20 years. Apparently, one of the biggest challenges that they faced in the development of the game was actually in integrating magic into the world. You see, Tolkien's idea of magic doesn't fit very well into a system. The magic doesn't translate very well at all into a video game, where in order to have some kind of standard for combat, you need your magic to be dictated by things like spells, like mana points. You need to understand exactly how much damage a spell will do and what kind of damage that is. For Tolkien, the only real magic users that he has in his world are people like Gandalf or the elves, people who have received some kind of divine power, and their magic doesn't occur in the form of spells that they cast, it's more like miracles bestowed upon them by the one god, Eru Ilúvatar. On top of that, they were dealing with the age-old issue. How do you allow the canon events of The Lord of the Rings to play out whilst also giving your players agency? Executive producer Aaron Campbell explains, "The goal is to ultimately be authentic and respectful to the material. It's a challenge to figure out how to have variety as well as continuity to Tolkien's story. You're not going to be Frodo or Aragorn, but if you can have that kind of impact on the world and see it, then you're a part of it, and it's exciting. You're the hero." And it seems like The Lord of the Rings Online managed to find and strike that balance pretty well, because, again, nearly 20 years later, the game is still going, with new expansions released as recently as 2021. Lord of the Rings Online is proof that games don't need to have all of the bells and whistles, the really intense storylines, or the groundbreaking graphics in order to have people that want to play this game. A lot of people are just excited to escape into their favorite world for a while. In 2009, EA's journey with the Lord of the Rings video games came to a close with The Lord of the Rings Conquest. This was developed by Pandemic Studios, the same folks who created Star Wars Battlefront, and although it had a little bit of buzz going up into its release, it is generally regarded as a bit of a letdown. The Lord of the Rings Conquest follows the format established by Star Wars Battlefront, letting players become a soldier from a chosen faction, like men, elves, Gondorians, Haradrim, etc., and having them level up by killing their opponents. Although it has a small and dedicated fan base, this game is pretty much regarded as half-baked and shallow, over-relying on movie nostalgia rather than actual storytelling, and it ended EA's Middle-earth's game franchise on a bit of a whimper. But with the production of the Hobbit films in the works, EA would lose the rights to The Lord of the Rings to Warner Bros. Games division, and the very first game that they would put out was 2010's The Lord of the Rings: Aragorn's Quest. This was a third-person action-adventure game, technically taking place 15 years after the events of The Lord of the Rings, where it is framed as Samwise Gamgee sitting his son down and telling him about Aragorn's adventures. So the player plays primarily Aragorn, retreading the events of The Lord of the Rings from Aragorn's perspective. This is a fine premise, but overall it seems like the writing was uninspired, the graphics were unimpressive, the stylized, child-centered story just didn't really resonate with their target audiences. Overall, this game is written off as a nostalgia-grabbing, rushed job. The next Warner Bros. Game entry would be received marginally better, 2011's The Lord of the Rings: The War of the North. This was more of an action hack-and-slash, which followed 3 adventurers set on their own quest to aid in the canon events of The Lord of the Rings. The gameplay is somewhat similar to that of Diablo, and the game managed to gain a bit of pre-publication buzz. Upon release, though, this game was not well loved, although it seems that in recent years, looking at the game in retrospect, people are appreciating it a little bit more. Their next attempt was Guardians of Middle-earth in 2012, a League of Legends-style game that faced players off against each other in online battle arenas. And this game went over okay. It's fine, it was playable, but it was once again noted that it was a kind of shallow interpretation of the Lord of the Rings story and its lore, and the very oversimplified style and mechanics didn't lend itself very well to the complex story that the Lord of the Rings tells. But this game was notable in that it was the first time that Warner Bros. Commissioned a game from Monolith, who we'll talk about more later. In 2012, of course, we got the LEGO Lord of the Rings. Following the format of many LEGO games before it, this game retold the Lord of the Rings as a sort of spoof, inserting a lot of humor and making the overall tone more family-friendly. It was a game that was meant to fondly recount the story of the Lord of the Rings for both children and adults, and in that was its goal, it did that very well, and it got pretty good sales. This game was followed up by the LEGO Hobbit in 2014. This game adapted the story of the first 2 Hobbit movies, that is right up until the Smaug attack in the book, and it did fine. There was actually a planned sequel, which would adapt the 3rd Hobbit film, The Battle of the Five Armies, but sales for the Hobbit LEGO were not good enough to justify making that 3rd game, and so it was scrapped. That same year, in 2014, we got Middle-earth: The Shadow of Mordor. Once again created by Monolith Productions, this game is legendary. This action-adventure game is set between the events of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, and it follows a Gondorian captain named Talion as he watches his family be killed by orcs. He's taken over by the spirit of a wraith, and he sets out on a journey to exact revenge and figure out what exactly he has become. Integrating lore-famous characters like Celebrimbor and movie favorites like Saruman and Gollum, this game managed to strike the perfect balance between new content and familiar content. As the game's senior technical designer Jason Booth explains, I think it's much, much better from a gameplay perspective to look at these spaces where things that were mentioned in the book or film weren't elaborated on. That's a great opportunity to make a game so people are aware of it, but it's an area that's all there for you to fill. You can make up any story and new characters. The act of playing the game itself can expand the universe. Shadow of Mordor is honestly a beautiful game in so many ways. The graphics are great. For the visuals, they worked with the film's Weta workshop in order to get them just right. They consulted multiple Tolkien scholars and lore experts in order to develop the plot. This game also coined the Nemesis system, in which the game tracks certain enemies that Talion crossed paths with, and allows those enemies to advance in power and station as the game progresses. This means that you're not just fighting faceless enemies, you're fighting, a nemesis. This game is still praised as one of, if not the best, Lord of the Rings video games, and I think that is in part due to how much attention they paid to the story. By finding a relatively unoccupied niche in the lore and endeavoring to tell a genuinely compelling and original story that is still founded in that beloved lore, Shadow of Mordor managed to strike gold in awards, in sales, and in legacy. A few years later, in 2017, the game's sequel, Middle-earth: Shadow of War, would be released. This goes on from the plot of the first game, following Talion to Mount Doom, and exploring the forging of a new, uncorrupted ring. This game is pretty similar to the first one. The only major difference I was able to find is that there was some backlash over microtransactions. If you're unfamiliar with microtransactions, it's basically when a game stops and allows you to use real-world money to pay for in-game advantages. And we can discuss the morality of microtransactions in general another day. Surprise, surprise, I do not like them. However, it felt particularly scummy with Shadow of War because some players felt like they had made portions of the game intentionally tedious. It was these parts of the game where you just had to grind for hours and hours in order to accomplish the next plot point. They felt that they had made those parts of the game intentionally difficult to encourage people to pay real-world money into these microtransactions, which just is not a great way to do it if you are going to use microtransactions. Fortunately, the developers would take this criticism into account, and although they never officially apologized, they did admit that these microtransactions undermined the heart of the game, and they took them out, which is a good thing. Another thing that this game is notable for is its inclusion of Shelob, and they portray Shelob as a giant spider who can also shapeshift into a very sexy goth woman. This choice, while frankly bizarre, is explained as part of an effort to further explore her character and the ways in which she functions as an inverse character to Galadriel. But honestly, I just find this choice really fun, even if it is a little bit goofy, and I think it's proof that the thing that these games got really right was observing canon and then very intentionally choosing where they were going to deviate from that canon. Although not quite as legendary and well-regarded as its predecessor, Shadow of War is still a very highly praised game to this day. Now, following Shadow of War, there haven't actually been any more official games created by Warner Brothers, but there have been games created by other companies that take place in Middle-earth. In 2018, Asmodee Digital put out the Lord of the Rings adventure card game. Although slower paced, this game has been commended for its solid art and unique gameplay, as well as the way in which it doesn't try to be anything more than what it is, a digital card game. In 2023, we saw the release of the ever-infamous The Lord of the Rings Gollum. And this game, it was just bad. It looked bad, the story was bad, the gameplay was bad, overall just not a great thing. One of the reviews I read described it as like watching a car crash in slow motion. An action-adventure game that tracks Gollum in the time between The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, this game didn't just suffer from being a bad game, it went against the very purpose of video games. Players felt like they had no real agency, like their actions had a negligible impact on the story. After After the very public humiliation that was the release of this game, the game's publishers actually closed their games development division entirely, and it seems like the game has been mostly abandoned. That same year, in 2023, we got The Lord of the Rings: Return to Moria, created by North Beach Games. This is a surviving, crafting-style game where you play a dwarf following Gimli after the events of The Lord of the Rings, trying to reclaim the dwarven homeland. This game includes the voice of John Rhys-Davies, the actor from the movie, as Gimli, which is a nice touch, but it never got a whole lot of buzz and has been written off as a bit tedious. And now, as of 2025, very recently, as of this video coming out, we're seeing our newest entry, Tales of the Shire, a Lord of the Rings game. Made in collaboration with Weta Workshop, this game is a low-pressure, slice-of-life, kind of Animal Crossing meets the Lord of the Rings life simulator, where you get to play a hobbit living their happy little life in the Shire. It seems like the game will mostly consist of cooking, gardening, fishing, and home decorating, heavy on the music, and cute mechanics like being guided around by birds. The release date of this game has been pushed back again and again, but I do believe that it is actually going to come out as of this video's publication or a couple of days before. So if you do play the game, let me know what you think of it. I've seen a couple of reviews that seem fairly positive. Some people don't really like the art style, and yeah, I suppose that's a matter of taste. I'm certainly not going to be playing it because I haven't played any Lord of the Rings video games, but I am curious to hear what you guys think of it in the comments. At the very least, I can respect just how different this game is compared to every Lord of the Rings video game that has come before, and I hope that it's able to find its audience with those who are a bit hobbitish at heart. Now, it is worth mentioning that there's a number of Lord of the Rings or Middle-earth inspired games that I wasn't able to fit into this video. If I had gone into mobile games, this would have stopped being a short video, which was what I was trying to make today. I don't even know if that happened, but there's also been card games, role-playing games, Trivial Pursuit. There have been so many Lord of the Rings based games. And beyond just what's officially Middle-earth based, who can say how many Lord of the Rings spin-offs there have been that don't technically claim to be Lord of the Rings spin-offs because they didn't want to have to pay for the rights? Things inspired by the story, or based on the story, or pulling characters that are practically the characters from the Lord of the Rings. There truly is infinite variety when it comes to Lord of the Rings based video games. And what's a little surprising to me is, despite the fact that there have been so many versions, there isn't really any version of the Lord of the Rings video game that is considered definitive. Shadow of Mordor could be argued to take that place, but it's kind of more of a spin-off fanfiction than any kind of an adaptation, and it is at odds with many aspects of the Lord of the Rings core story. But honestly, I think that the main reason there hasn't been a definitive Lord of the Rings video game adaptation is because the story of the Lord of the Rings just doesn't adapt that well to the video game format. As I explored before, there's particular details like the fact that the magic system isn't a system at all and doesn't translate very well to video game mechanics. Beyond that, many video games rely on combat as their main function, their main way to advance through the story. And the Lord of the Rings, despite how many wars and fights it contains, does decenter conflict and combat very seriously. It's kind of part of the core messaging. As Tolkien's favorite character, Faramir, said, "War must be, while we defend our lives against a destroyer who would devour all, but I do not love the bright sword for its sharpness, nor the arrow for its swiftness, nor the warrior for his glory. I love only that which they defend." Thus, when a video game is trying to interpret this story, but they're forced to give you experience points for killing orcs, you're going on side quests to hunt bears, it's never going to resonate at quite the same frequency that Tolkien's works do. Now, that's not to say that video games and the kind of stories that they tell and the mechanics that they use are bad. There is a reason that the sword and sorcery genre emerged from the works that Tolkien wrote. There's a reason that tabletop role-playing games and video games have become so massively popular. As a method of storytelling in which the story is shaped and informed by the audience's actions, video games are an absolutely revolutionary way to tell stories, and I massively respect what they're able to do. Now, all of that being said, video games are not the best structure through which to tell the stories of Tolkien. Now, it's a whole thing online that people really like to talk about whether or not Tolkien would have liked something, especially adaptations of his work. And I can and have criticized people talking about this because it's kind of a useless venture. He is dead. However, I think this is one of the rare situations in which I can pretty definitively say that Tolkien wouldn't have liked any of the Middle-earth video games. During his lifetime, he was hesitant enough about any movie adaptations getting made. The only reason he was willing to even entertain the idea is because he was self-admittedly broke and really needed the cash. But even with the weight of retirement and unemployment hanging over his head, Tolkien was heavily critical of every version of a movie script that was put in front of him. When he was presented with a storyline of a movie, just a rough draft by Morton Grady Zimmerman, he ripped it apart. He wrote in a letter, "He has cut the parts of the story upon which its characteristic and peculiar tone principally depends, showing a preference for fights, and he has made no serious attempt to represent the heart of the tale adequately, the journey of the ring-bearers. The last and most important pan of this has, and it is not too strong a word, simply been murdered." He hated the way that they emphasized battles and conflict. He hated the way that they reduced the idea of lembas bread into a food concentrate, because that totally devalued the initial meaning he had bestowed upon lembas bread as representative of the Catholic Eucharistic tradition. Simply put, Tolkien could not stand the idea of his story being adapted, no matter how skillful the adaptation. In his essay on fairy stories, he proclaimed, "In human art, fantasy is a thing best left to words, to true literature." Tolkien didn't like theater. He didn't like film adaptations of his book. He didn't like audio drama adaptations of his book. I think it's safe to say he would have taken issues with a direct text-to-speech audiobook, and based on that, I think it's fair to say that he wouldn't have really loved any video game adaptations of his much-beloved story. After all, as we've seen, even the most faithful of these games had to dramatically change the way that the story is told in order for it to be a playable video game. But with all of that being said, I think it's so important to note that the opinions of Tolkien and the opinions of the Tolkien estate are not the be-all and end-all of what Tolkien's legacy is. In fact, I think it's quite telling that the most successful Lord of the Rings video games have been the ones that most radically retold these stories, putting them in a new place with a new voice, interpreting new themes and new characters. The very best adaptations are the ones that use the very unique tools available through the art of video games to tell a story that deviates from the original source material, while being grounded in that older material. Video games are a really interesting space, and I kind of love how free and diverse the history of Middle-earth video games is. There's such an obvious desire to try things out, to take this beloved story and stretch it and move it and peer through it into new unseen places. While adaptations as a whole will always be a very touchy subject, I'm very glad to take a peek into the world of Lord of the Rings video games and find the practice of skillful, artful adaptation alive, thriving, and well. I'm really hoping that my lack of expertise about video games did not come through in this video. Like I said, I played them as a kid, but I just don't play them as an adult. Frankly, I don't have time. I have like 2 hobbies, and both of them are things that contribute to this job, so that's healthy. But anyway, if you have any notes or adjustments about the things that I talked about in this video, go ahead and let me know in the comments below, and if I made any major issues, I will talk about those in the pinned comment. But in the comments, if you have played any Lord of the Rings video games, let me know which your favorite is, and if you haven't played any like me, let me know which one you found the most interesting. Give this video a like if you enjoyed it, and be sure to share it with your friend who you play video games with, and consider subscribing if you want to tune in every week to hear me talk about the Lord of the Rings, the art of storytelling, and the other stuff that I like to talk about. Thank you so much for joining me this week and every week, and I hope that you have a very happy, Hobbity day.